There is a photograph from the Oregon woods taken in the year 1921, and in it, a man named Axel Hallgren is walking up the side of a tree. Not climbing it the way a boy climbs, hand over hand. Walking up it, leaned back against a rope looped around the trunk, spikes on his boots biting into the bark, an axe in one hand with nothing beneath his heels but 200 feet of open air. The ground is so far below that the men standing on it look like dropped tools. And this was not a stunt for the camera. This was his job. Every working day, Axel Hallgren and a few hundred men like him scattered through the forests of the Pacific Northwest climbed higher than the top of a 20-story building on nothing but a rope and a pair of spurs to do the single most dangerous piece of work in the whole deadly business of logging. They were called high climbers, or high riggers, and they were the elite of the woods. The best paid, the most respected, the most reckless, the men every green kid in camp wanted to be, and most of them had the sense not to try. Because the high climber did something that sounds insane when you say it plainly. He climbed a living tree, one of the giant firs of that country, and as he went, he chopped off every limb with a short-handled axe. And then, when he was near the very top, 200 feet up, he cut the entire crown of the tree off above his own head, and rode out the explosion that followed. And here is the part that stops me cold. The moment that severed top broke free, the whole tree, suddenly relieved of the weight it had carried for a century, would snap and whip back and forth through the air in great violent arcs, with the climber lashed to it, hanging on, 200 feet up, while the trunk he was tied to bucked like an animal, trying to throw him. Men did this on purpose. And when it was over, they went back to work. We remember the machines from those forests. The steam engines, the donkeys, the locomotives. But the whole system those machines ran on depended first on one man going up a tree with an axe. And I want to give that man his due, because almost nobody remembers his name. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button. Come back. Because to understand why anyone would climb 200 feet up a tree just to cut the top off it, you have to understand the problem the logging companies were trying to solve. And the problem was weight. The trees of the Pacific Northwest were, and where they still stand, are the largest living things most people will ever see. Douglas firs and cedars and spruces that had been growing since before Columbus, some of them tall enough to shame a city building, with trunks so thick that a felled log could weigh more than a locomotive. Cutting one down was hard enough. But then you had this colossal dead weight lying on the forest floor, in rough country, miles from any mill, and you had to get it out. And oxen could not do it fast enough, and horses could not do it at all, and even the mighty steam donkey, the engine that changed everything, could only drag a log along the ground, plowing it through the mud and the stumps and the standing timber, where it snagged and stuck and tore up everything in its path. So somebody had a better idea. What if you did not drag the log along the ground at all? What if you lifted the front end of it up into the air and flew it over the obstacles to the landing? To do that, you needed a mast, a tall, strong pole with a pulley at the top, so you could run a cable up and over and pull the log toward you and up at the same time. And in a forest, you do not have to build a mast. The forest is full of them, already standing, already rooted deeper than any mast you could sink. You just have to take the biggest, strongest, best-placed tree in the area and turn it into your derrick. And that is what a spar tree is. A living tree, stripped and topped and rigged, made into the central mast of the whole logging show. And the man who made it was the high climber. And he did not work alone, though he was the only one who went up the tree. A logging show was a small industrial army, and the spar tree stood at the center of it. Down on the ground was the rigging crew, the men who wrapped the heavy chokers, the loops of cable, around each log so it could be pulled in. There was the whistle punk, often a boy, whose whole job was to yank a wire that blew a steam whistle in coded blasts, relaying the signals that told the distant engineer when to pull and when to stop, because the man running the donkey could not see the log he was hauling, and one wrong pull would kill someone. There was the engineer on the steam donkey, and the chaser at the landing who freed the logs, and the buckers and the fallers out in the timber. The whole roaring operation worked around the mast, and none of it could begin until the high climber had turned a standing tree into that mast. Before the high lead came in, the donkeys had simply dragged the logs along the ground on a cable, ground lead they called it, and the logs plowed and snagged and hung up on every stump in the way. Lifting the front end into the air on a tall spar was the leap that made the whole thing fast, And the price of that leap was a man 200 feet up with an axe. And it started with choosing the tree. Not just any giant would do. The spar had to be tall so it could lift the logs high. It had to be straight and sound, with no hidden rot in the heart of the trunk that would let go under load. It had to be deep-rooted and solid, because it was about to be pulled on hard from every direction at once. And it had to stand in exactly the right place, at the center of the ground they meant to log, close enough to the landing and the rail. Choose wrong and you had a spar that failed or a show badly placed, so the choice was made with care, and then it was handed to the climber, who looked up at the tree he was about to trust his life to, buckled on his spurs, and started up. Now think about what that job actually required, because every part of it was a way to die. First, he had to get up there. In the early days, before the climbing spurs, men did it the hard way, cutting notches into the trunk and jamming in springboards, those tapered planks with a lip of angled iron on the end, and standing on one board to cut the slot for the next, walking themselves up the tree one narrow plank at a time. Later came the climber's real tools, a pair of sharp steel spurs strapped to the boots, and a stout rope with a core of wire running through it, the flip line thrown around the trunk and buckled to the belt on both hips. The climber leaned back against that rope so it held him tight to the tree, kicked his spurs into the bark, and then, in the motion that defined the whole trade, he flipped the rope a foot up the trunk, stepped up, flipped it again, stepped up again. Lean back, kick in, flip the line, climb. 200 feet of it, straight up, with the trunk narrowing and swaying more with every foot he gained. And he was not just climbing. He was working the whole way up. Every branch that came within reach of that short axe had to be cut clean off, because a spar tree with limbs on it is no good to anybody, and because those limbs were the handholds and the ledges he could not afford to leave for the rope to catch on. So he climbed one-handed and chopped with the other, 200 feet in the air, clearing the trunk as he went, sap running down the bark and gumming everything, the tree getting thinner and whippier the higher he climbed, the wind that you never feel on the ground, starting to push at him up where the tree could bend. By the time he neared the top, he was standing on spurs driven into a trunk, perhaps a few feet thick, swaying in the wind, with the entire forest spread out flat and small beneath his boots. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Then came the moment the whole job was built around. The topping. When the climber reached the height he wanted, where the trunk had narrowed to about 3 or 4 feet across, still thick enough to be a strong mast but slim enough to cut, he set his rope, braced his spurs, and began to chop through the tree above his own head. Understand what he was cutting. Above him was still a huge piece of tree, tons of green wood and branches, the entire crown of a forest giant, and he was severing it with an axe while tied to the trunk just below the cut. He worked an undercut on one side and then chopped from the other, and he had to read the lean and the wind exactly right, because he needed that top to fall away clean, out, and off, and not to split down the trunk toward him, and not to kick back into him as it went. And when it finally let go, the tree tried to kill him. That is not an exaggeration. A tree that has carried the weight of its crown for 100 years is under enormous strain. Bent and balanced around that load, and the instant you cut the top off, all of that stored energy releases at once. The trunk springs upright and then past upright, and then whips back the other way and back again, snapping through the air in arcs that could be many feet wide at the top, over and over until the energy bleeds off. And the climber is tied to it, near the very top, at the point where the whip is most violent. His entire job in that moment was to hold on, to press himself to the trunk, grip the rope, and ride the bucking tree through its death throes without being snapped off it like a bug off a whip. Photographs and old film of that instant are genuinely hard to watch. The top tumbling away, the whole spar lashing side to side, and a small human figure clamped to it, absorbing every jolt. Men were thrown. Men were killed. And the ones who wrote it out did it again the next day, on the next show, for as long as their nerve and their luck held. I have tried to imagine what those minutes were actually like up there, and I do not think most of us can. There is the cold, first of all, and the wind, which barely exists on the forest floor, but which, up at the top of a swaying 200-foot trunk, pushes and gusts and moves the whole tree under you in slow, sickening circles. There is the pitch, the sticky sap, coating the bark and the rope and the gloves until everything is glued and fouled. There is the exposure, the plain animal fact of the drop, which the climber had to shut out of his mind completely, because a man who lets himself truly feel that height stops being able to work. And there is the sheer labor of it, because once he was up, he had to haul his heavy gear up after him, the blocks and the cable ends drawn up on a lighter line, hand over hand. Hundreds of pounds of steel lifted the last stretch by the arms of a man balanced on two spikes in a moving tree. It was not a climb followed by a rest. It was a climb followed by the hardest and most delicate work of the day, done in the worst possible place on earth to do any work at all. I keep coming back to what it took to be that man, day after day. It was not a young man's dare done once to prove something. It was a career. There is film of a high climber named Hap Johnson, one of the most celebrated riggers of the old high lead days, a man so good at it that he later doubled for John Wayne in a Hollywood picture and was still topping spars for the camera in his 60s, an age when most men who had done that work were long since dead or crippled or wisely retired to the ground. Hap Johnson topping a tree in his 60s tells you everything about the kind of person this took, not a reckless kid. A master craftsman of a trade that happened to be lethal, who had done the impossible so many thousands of times that he could do it old. And there were others like him, their names known only in the valleys where they worked, men who topped their first spar as teenagers and were still doing it when their own sons had joined the crew. The trade selected hard for a rare combination: the strength to climb and chop all day, the fine judgment of an engineer, and a nervous system that simply did not register the drop the way an ordinary person's does. You could not train most men into it, because most men, set on two spikes at 200 feet with a whipping tree bucking under them, would freeze, and freezing was fatal. The ones who could do it were a type, and the woods knew them, and paid them well, and buried a good many of them, and made legends of the rest. Because once the tree was topped, the climber's most dangerous minute was over. But his skilled work was just beginning. Now he had to turn that bare, swaying pole into a machine. Hanging up there at the top of his new spar, he rigged it. He hauled up and bolted on the heavy steel blocks, the pulleys the main cables would run through. He set the guy lines, a dozen or more massive cables running from near the top of the spar down to stumps, anchored all around the clearing, turning the single tree into the strong center of a great web that could take the strain of pulling logs weighing tons through the air. A spar tree fully rigged carried extraordinary loads, and if the climber had read the tree wrong, or set a guy line slack, or missed a split in the trunk, the whole thing could fail under load and bring cable and steel and tree down on the crew below. The rigging was its own science. Near the very top went the biggest pulley of all, the main block that the haul cable ran through, and below it more blocks for the lines that pulled the empty cable back out to the woods. The guy lines fanned out and down from near the top like the strands of a web, and their number and their tension were everything, because they had to hold the spar rigid against a sideways pull of many tons without letting it lean or crack. A properly rigged spar could stand a strain that is genuinely hard to believe of a single tree, precisely because the climber had shared that strain out among a dozen anchored cables. Get the geometry right and the tree became a machine that could work for years. Get it wrong and the first heavy log would find the mistake, and everyone standing under it would pay. So he was not only the bravest man on the show, he was, in that moment, its chief engineer, and the lives of everyone working under that spar depended on his judgment about a tree he had just climbed. Before I tell you what happened next, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click, come back. And when it all worked, it was one of the most impressive things in American industry. Picture the finished show. The spar tree stands in the middle of the clearing, stripped and topped and strung with steel, its blocks hanging ready. Out in the timber, hundreds of feet away, the fallers have brought down a giant. The steam donkey coughs and roars and takes up the slack, and the main cable, running up and over the block at the top of the spar, comes tight. And the front end of that enormous log lifts up off the ground and swings into the air, and comes flying in toward the landing, over the stumps and the brush and the broken ground that would have stopped a dragged log cold. In the biggest operations, they ran a cable clear across the valley from one spar tree to another and flew the logs through the sky on it, a system they called the skyline. Logs weighing as much as a house, sailing over the treetops on a wire, and every bit of it hung, In the end, on the one tree the high climber had turned into a mast, and on the top he had cut off it with an axe while tied to its neck. When a show was running well, it had a rhythm to it that old loggers talked about for the rest of their lives. The whistle would shriek its coated blasts. The donkey would open up with a roar and a cloud of steam. The cables would come singing tight, and out in the timber, a log as long as a house and heavier than one would break loose and come rushing in, half flying, throwing dirt, the ground crew scattering out of its path, until it swung up under the spar and hung there swaying while the next signal sent it on to the landing. Log after log all day, the whole clattering, screaming, dangerous ballet, of it turning around the single quiet fact in the middle, the mast, the topped tree, standing exactly where a man had made it stand. The men who did this knew exactly what they were, and so did everyone around them. The high climber was the aristocrat of the logging camp. He was paid more than any other man in the woods, in an era when a top faller might make $6 for a hard day's work, and a choke setter counted himself well off at $80 a month. The climber stood above them all, literally, and in his pay and in his standing, and he knew it, and he tended to walk through camp like it. There was showmanship in it. On a Sunday, or at a fair, a great climber would top a spar for a crowd, cut the head off a tree, and ride the whip for an audience that gasped and cheered, and the best of them became local legends, their names known up and down the logging country the way a town knows the name of its fastest man. It was one of the very few working-class jobs in America where raw physical courage, done in front of everyone, made you famous. And it was fame paid for in a currency of constant, casual, mortal risk. You could pick the high climber out in any crowd of loggers, and he made sure of it. He wore his trade. The trousers cut short at the boot so they could not catch on anything, the heavy spurs, the coil of the flip line over his shoulder, and a manner that came from knowing he did the one job nobody else in camp would take. Camps competed for the best climbers the way a ball club competes for a star, and a great one could name his terms and move on when he liked. Because a logging show without a man who could rig a spar was a show that could not run. The stories about the famous ones grew tall in the retelling. The climber who topped a tree in a storm, the one who rode a whip that would have thrown anyone else clean off, the one who could walk up a trunk faster than another man could climb a ladder. Some of it was surely stretched in the bunkhouse at night. It did not need to be. The plain truth of the job, a man cutting the head off a forest giant 200 feet up while lashed to its neck, was already taller than any story anyone could invent. Because for every legend who topped spars into his 60s, there were men who did not see 30. The work killed in a dozen ways. The whip of the topping threw men to their deaths. Rotten wood high in a trunk gave way under a spur without warning. A guy line understrained could part and cut a man in half. A block could fail and fall. Widowmakers, the loose limbs and broken tops hung up above, could drop at any moment onto the man working below them. Logging as a whole was one of the deadliest trades in the country, and the high climber worked at the deadly heart of it, at the top of the deadliest single task. In the peak years, the woods took a steady toll that would be a national scandal today. Men crushed and cut and dropped and drowned in numbers that everyone simply accepted as the price of the timber. The high climber's particular deaths were the spectacular ones. The falls the whole crew saw, the topping that went wrong in front of everyone. A rigger who slipped did not get a second chance to catch himself. There was nothing up there to catch him. The men accepted it the way soldiers accept a war, with grim humor and superstition and a refusal to talk about it much. And they went up the tree the next morning all the same. Because that was the job. And because there was nobody else in camp who could do it, and both facts made them proud. One quick note. I turned the full story into a book. Everything the records gave me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And then, almost overnight in the long view of things, the whole trade vanished. The high climber was not killed off by safety rules or by mercy. He was made obsolete by steel. In the 1960s and into the 1970s, the logging companies began to replace the spar tree with a machine, a portable steel tower that could be hauled in on a truck, set up in an afternoon, and moved to the next show when this one was cut out. No climbing required. A steel spar does not have to be found, and it does not have to be climbed, and it does not rot, and it does not care about the wind, and it does not need a 200-foot living tree standing in exactly the right spot. It just needs a truck and a road. And with that, the reason for the high climber simply evaporated. Why send a man up a tree to risk his life making a mast when you could unfold one from the back of a truck? The skill that had taken a lifetime to master and a great deal of nerve to use was, in the space of a few years, no longer needed at all. The last of the old high climbers topped their last spars and hung up their spurs and became old men telling stories that the young men in the steel tower crews could barely believe. A little of it survives in a strange afterlife. Go to a logging festival in the timber country today, and you can still watch men race up a spar pole and ring a bell at the top and come down. Speed climbing turned into a weekend sport, a memory of the trade made into a spectacle. And the climbing gear the old riggers used, the spurs and the flip line, lives on in the kit of the arborists who trim and take down trees in our cities now. But the thing itself, the working high climber who topped a living giant to make the mast that an entire industry hung from, is gone, and it is not coming back, because nobody will ever need to do it again. And what went with them was not only a job but a body of knowledge that had no other home. A high climber carried in his hands and his nerves 100 small judgments that were never written in any manual. How a fir would whip compared to a cedar, how to read a gust before it hit, how much trunk to leave below the cut, when a top was going to split and when it would fly clean, how tight to set a guy line for the pull he expected. It was the kind of knowing that lives only in a person who has done a thing 10,000 times. And when the steel towers came and the last climbers retired, that knowing was not handed down, because there was no longer anyone who needed it. It simply ended in a few dozen old men, and then it was gone. I think about what a modern safety engineer sees when he watches the old film of a high climber topping a spar, because his reaction is not admiration first, it is horror. There is no harness that would pass an inspection today, no fall arrest, no hard hat that would matter, no backup if the rope fails or the trunk splits, nothing at all between that man and a 200-foot fall except his own skill and a rope around a tree. By every standard we now hold, the job was indefensible, and yet it was done tens of thousands of times by men who mastered it so completely that the great ones grew old doing it. That is the thing the horror misses. These were not daredevils throwing their lives away. They were craftsmen who had taken a task that should have been impossible and made it a profession, who read a tree and the wind and the lean the way a sailor reads the sea, and who carried the whole roaring industrial logging show up a tree on their backs, one flip of the rope at a time. So the next time you see one of those old photographs, the tiny figure impossibly high on a bare trunk, with the forest spread out beneath him, do not just see a stunt. See a working man at the top of his trade. See Axel Hallgren in 1921, spurs in the bark, axe in his hand, doing on an ordinary Tuesday the thing the rest of us would not do once for any amount of money. See the whole system of steam and steel and timber that hung from the mast he made. And see how completely we have forgotten him, the aristocrat of the woods, the bravest and best paid man in the deadliest trade in the country, replaced by a machine that folds out of a truck, his name gone off the tree he climbed, his courage remembered now only in a handful of photographs where he is so high up you can barely make out his face. There is a comparison I cannot shake. We hand out a great deal of admiration, and rightly, to the men who climbed the first mountains and flew the first airplanes and did the dangerous, celebrated things of that same age. The high climber did something just as dangerous, with far less to gain and no fame beyond his own county, and he did it not once for glory, but every working day for wages, to make a mast so that other men could move logs. There was no summit at the top of his tree. There was only more work, a top to cut, a whip to ride, and then the long climb back down to do it all again on the next tree tomorrow. That is a kind of courage we do not really have a word for. The courage of a man who is simply very good at a lethal job and shows up to do it, and keeps showing up until a machine makes him unnecessary and the whole thing is quietly forgotten. He was not a mystery, and he was not a myth. He was a man with an axe and a rope, and a level of nerve we have half forgotten was ever possible. And every log that flew over those forests flew because he went up first. That is worth remembering. That is worth saying out loud. The high climber went higher than the machines and higher than the fear, and he did it for a living, and he did it with his hands. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout out in upcoming videos, members only investigations, plus everything from boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.